Hello, this is Dr. Payne. I'm here to present my belated lecture on the World War I and 1920s period. So first, I want to give some background. I'm going to divide this into three sections. First section is going to cover what happens before World War I, particularly the progressive era. Number two, what happens during World War I, how the progressive era becomes unraveled and there's a conservative reaction. And third, in the 1920s, during conservative governance, how society still changes rapidly. And so there's a lot of literary output after World War I that's reflecting on the rise and failure of the progressive movement, on prohibition, and an anti-war sentiment. So first, let's deal with the progressives. The progressives are a movement that is attempting to be a moderate force. I know in today's language, when you hear progressive, you think conservative versus progressive. In this time period, progressives see themselves as a middle way between two extremes. On one extreme, they see the conservative faction, which is aligned with big business, often dominated by monopolies, or as they called them in those days, trusts, combinations of businesses dominating a particular industry. It could be iron, it could be paper bags, it could be nails, it could be railroads, it could be any particular sector of the market, usually an industry output like steel. And those who were wishing to counter these trusts tended to be those who were called radicals. So for example, socialists were radical because they sought to control the means of production, those businesses, not in the hands of a few stockholders or corporate boards, but instead in the hands of the people who worked the railroads and organizations that represented the people, such as the government. So socialists tried to have government, or the people, the laborers, controlling the means of production in society. And this set up a tension between, on the one hand, on, I guess, your right hand, capital, those who controlled the means of production, the bourgeoisie, as communists would say, and the proletariat, the workers, laborers. So again, you have a struggle between the conservatives, big business, and radicals, labor movements. And labor also entertained other radical ideas. There was not just socialism, there was a more extreme form of socialism called communism, developed by folks like Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in Europe, who were saying that not only would there be a clash between capital and labor, but that labor would eventually win and it would be a violent revolution. Right? You also had people like anarchists who wanted to overthrow all sorts of government and corporate control over life. And all these groups were grouped together as radicals, usually favoring labor against capital. Progressives saw themselves in the middle, and they tended to be predictably, middle-class people. And these middle-class folks were deeply interested in alleviating this tension between labor and capital. How do we find a middle way? How do we have them have peace together? We want the prosperity of modern business, all that it can produce for us, producing cheaper and better goods at ever-increasing rates, but we also don't want the rabble to take control. The middle class were more numerous than the very wealthy aristocracy of the robber barons, the virtual aristocracy because of their great wealth, but also they were afraid of the hoi polloi, the ordinary people, the laboring classes, the masses. So they wanted government that was not controlled with a stranglehold by these corporations. Right? They were reacting against more right-wing conservatism, and they wanted something in between. Radicalism and conservatism, progressivism. They wanted to see progress. They wanted some reforms to appease laboring classes, but not give all the power to labor. And they don't want to give all the power to corporations either. They wanted power somewhere in the middle with themselves. So progressives are a remarkable movement because, again, they try to find a middle way, and they take power in 1901 with the death of President McKinley, who was shot by an assassin, Czolgosz, an anarchist on the radical side, and Teddy Roosevelt from the Republican Party. So he seems to be somewhat conservative, but he's actually more of a progressive in the middle. And he seeks to immediately impose, Theodore Roosevelt, Teddy as he was called, to restrict the powers of the corporate sector, to regulate businesses, to break up trusts that he thought were too big, too powerful in the marketplace. And this was a way of allowing middle-class people, moderate people in their view, to attempt to avoid class warfare avoid radicalism by moderating, controlling big businesses through the only organization that could temper the power of big business, the federal government. And they did so fairly effectively under FDR, limiting the power of the big businesses, forcing big businesses and labor to come to compromises that they would find mutually beneficial, and again, creating peace in society and harmony. That's how they thought about progress. Again, these folks who are progressive tend to be middle class, white, educated, interested in transparency, wanting to be disinterested, not wanting corporations or the radical masses to benefit too much from any given reform. They wanted to throw bones to both sides. And they were also interested in being scientific in their approaches, rational, efficiency-driven, all the benefits of modern business management, but instead of using that to concentrate wealth among the wealthy, they wanted to share the benefits of production with all, particularly the middle class. So they're looking for public good, not just private gain. But again, using the methods of business, methods of science to that end. So after Teddy Roosevelt, he ruled from 1901 to 1909. You had his successor, who was a bit more conservative, William Howard Taft from 1909 to 1913, and then Woodrow Wilson from 1913 to 1921. Again, you have an election, and this president becomes seated as president the following March in that time period. So these progressive presidents all agreed on this plan of limiting the powers of big business to some extent. Teddy Roosevelt also started the national parks system, a federal national parks system, conserving resources for the future, thinking about, again, the common good, the public good, not just private interest, not just immediate exploitation of goods. We also have a number of constitutional amendments. We have the 16th Amendment, the income taxation, legalized by the 16th Amendment. You have direct election of senators, 17th Amendment. In both of those are 1913. And then at the end of the progressive era, we have the prohibition of alcohol, the 18th Amendment, ratified in 1919. And then the 19th Amendment, 1920, gives women the right to vote. So in some ways, progressives were expanding the franchise, right? We have direct election of senators. It's not just state legislators that are controlling who gets elected anymore. It is, in fact, the people. And you also have votes for women. Again, expanding the franchise. What's not to like? Well, there is a darker side of the progressive movement. Not only for those who are concerned about the rising power of the federal government, but clearly morally objectionable stuff, such as racism. And those racism took two most obvious forms. First, eugenics. Eugenics, eu meaning good, genics meaning genes, good genes. And the way eugenicists sought to make good genes was to weed out the bad genes, by which they meant people that were unfit. For example, criminals, the mentally unstable, or the mentally backward, people who had genetic diseases that were limiting them. Anyone who did not fit the standard of middle-class, white, scientific folks at that time period were deemed degenerate, bad genes. And so tens of thousands of human beings in this country, citizens, were forcibly sterilized in prisons and many people outside of prisons, in the public at large. But most of them, many of them criminals, or those deemed insane. Again, against their will. And the Supreme Court okayed this in 1921. And these laws started in Indiana in 1907, continued into the 1970s, these eugenics laws, the forcible sterilization of people, including civil rights leaders like Fannie Lou Hamer, the leading civil rights advocate in the 1960s in the state of Mississippi, was herself forcibly sterilized. Not a criminal, had done nothing wrong, but the doctor saw fit to forcibly sterilize her. Again, tens of thousands of people affected in this way. And we can see where eugenics leads. If you think about weeding out bad genes, and if you start to define bad genes as certain racial or ethnic or religious minorities, we can see how this kind of thinking can lead to terrible things like the Holocaust. And because of the Holocaust, eugenics has gradually fallen out of favor. The idea of trying to cut out groups of people from the gene pool is now seen as it is, morally wrong and reprehensible. A second dark side of the progressive movement when it comes to race was Jim Crow laws. Now, Jim Crow laws were imposed mostly in the U.S. South in the 1890s and after 1900, and they included things in two categories. First, social separation. This is what we most commonly think of when we think of Jim Crow. For example, black Americans sit at the back of the bus, whites at the front of the bus, socially separating the classes, different drinking fountains, different bathrooms for people who are African American or Mexican American as opposed to white American. But it's more than just social separation, more than just some people sit in the gallery, some people sit at the main level, or white-only institutions. You also have the second side of it, which is political repression, taking away votes, taking away political activism as an opportunity, as an avenue for African Americans, principally by taking away the right to vote, which of course is constitutionally guaranteed in the 15th Amendment. But the Constitution is just a piece of paper, and it has been and can be ignored by people who lack the will to enforce it. So read the Constitution, seek to enforce the Constitution, please. It's a great document. So again, Jim Crow laws, taking away the rights of African Americans to vote, socially separating them. Why? The same reason that eugenics was targeting certain racial and ethnic groups and people with certain mental conditions or deemed insane. Because the people who are running different scientific academies, running hospitals, the medical professionals, these middle class, generally speaking, white people, were imposing their values on others as normative and punishing or sometimes cutting out of the gene pool people who did not fit up to their standards. And you had a lot of racial, scientific racism that was backed up by scientific language, saying that Caucasian people are at the top and African Americans at the bottom. And that was what they used to justify imperialism, colonization of other lands, and also second-class treatment of citizens who are not white in this own country. So the progressive movement is going on, and then the U.S. gets into World War I. Initially, the U.S. was neutral on the war. In the handout, there's a link to two songs that demonstrate the U.S.'s shift of opinion. In 1915, the hit song is I Didn't Raise My Boy to Be a Soldier. Hundreds of thousands of copies sold, right? This is a century ago. Selling hundreds of thousands of songs today is a big deal. Selling hundreds of thousands of copies of a song then is remarkable. It's an absolutely incredibly popular thing. So the vast majority of the country is anti-war. I Didn't Raise My Boy to Be a Soldier is his anti-war song. 2 years later, 1917, the hit song of the year is Over There. It celebrates the U.S. just having gone to war against Germany and is super patriotic. It takes a very different tone. Again, just 2 years later, the U.S. has gone from anti-war to pro-war. Why? There's a variety of reasons, mostly because the German Empire, which is one of the combatants in World War I going on in Europe, has been sinking U.S. ships despite the fact that they're neutral, and that's a big no-no. Americans were dying on the high seas because of German illegal submarine warfare against neutral ships. Secondly, because Germany had tried to make an alliance with Mexico against the United States in a secret dispatch called the Zimmermann Telegram, named after the German Foreign Secretary, Zimmermann. So, as a consequence, the United States says enough is enough. Germany is dangerously playing with diplomatic alliances with Mexico on our southern border. And secondly, shooting down our ships, killing our citizens. So we're going to go to war to protect neutral rights, because apparently neutrals have no rights anymore. So the United States goes to war against Germany, enters World War I in 1917. President Woodrow Wilson, the last of the three progressive presidents of this period, is in the presidency, pushes the war. The U.S. wins the war, long story short. And as the government wins the war, it's also increasing government and business cooperation. Again, this progressive idea of government oversight over the economy is being more and more realized during the war. But all this intervention in the economy is also going to bring a backlash later. But during the war and in the immediate aftermath of the war, progressives are able to push through some of their reforms, like prohibition. Again, women getting the vote, the 18th and 19th Amendments. Those are the last of the great progressive reforms. And we'll talk more about prohibition in a bit. But finishing up World War I, another major movement was the Great Migration. Not only did you have a lot of, generally speaking, white male soldiers going off to fight in Europe, you had a lot of white women and African Americans, generally men, that were stepping into these factory jobs that had traditionally been reserved for white men. And so a lot of African Americans in the rural South are moving into cities in the South and more into cities in the North where those factory jobs are. And this is the first time where you have a critical mass of hundreds of thousands of African Americans living in urban centers in the North. No longer is the African American population overwhelmingly concentrated in the South, but it's spreading out beyond the South to urban centers in the North. And during World War II, you're going to have another great migration of African Americans moving into these northern cities, so that there is a national network of African Americans, and increasingly African Americans are associated with urban culture. African Americans moving into a certain part of New York City called Harlem began what's called the Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s, where more African American intellectuals and artistic leaders are gathering together in this part of New York City that is distinctively African American, vastly majority African American, a place where Black Americans can celebrate Black pride in their culture and address a lot of the cultural issues that they see they're problematic, such as Jim Crow laws, and are able to mount a voice against that in a place in the North, in New York City, where it's relatively safe for Black Americans to do that. Now, when the war ends, World War I ends in 1918 is this armistice, and then the treaty, the Versailles Treaty, is approved the next year, which is ironing out the details of the peace. And this Versailles Treaty is masterminded as a collaboration work between the Allied powers in Europe, Britain, France, Italy. Russia had been knocked out of the war, become a communist nation, so they didn't consult them. But Italy, Britain, France, and the United States make this treaty. It's a compromise between the imperial ambitions of European powers and the idealism of Woodrow Wilson, this disinterested progressive, right? He just wants to enter the war because it's the right thing to do. He doesn't want the U.S. to get anything out of it. Nevertheless, the post-war order is much more attuned to the rights of neutral nations, and Wilson had masterminded this new League of Nations, kind of like the precursor to the United Nations, the UN, of its day. And this League of Nations was supposed to have the United States and other nations participating in this peacekeeping force of the UN. Well, some U.S. senators, a lot of them were Republicans, and they opposed Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat, as president, and they rejected the treaty. The U.S. did not enter the League of Nations, and as a consequence, the post-war peace was a lot more shaky than Wilson had hoped. However, the U.S. made a separate peace, so it ended the war in Europe, did not sign on to the Versailles Treaty, did not join the League of Nations, but it pursued instead an isolationist, non-interventionist, America first, you might say, foreign policy in the 1920s. Now, one of the reasons why the U.S. is so anti-internationalist is because after the war is over, before the peace treaty gets entirely worked out, there begins to be this reaction against all sorts of not only radical but even progressive agendas, a move towards more conservative values in the United States, and that most particularly takes form in the Red Scare. It starts in May 1919. On May 1st, a number of mail bombs were sent through the mail to famous businessmen and politicians. No one was killed, but these bombs did go off, and some people were injured. And as a consequence, the Attorney General, A. Mitchell Palmer, starts these raids against suspected radicals. Who would have sent the bombs? We didn't know who'd sent the bombs, but the suspicion is radicals. So communists, socialists, anarchists, and even just labor unions in general are now associated in the public mind with radicalism, with violence. Some people are afraid the United States is going to fall to communism because Russia, during World War I, became a communist nation, pulled out of World War I, kind of retreated into itself, and began to be the center of international communism. So the idea is, if Russia can fall to communists, maybe the United States can too. That was very unlikely, but that was the fear a lot of people had. And so thousands of people get arrested on suspicion of plotting against the government. Hundreds of people are deported, mostly Russians, back to their countries out of suspicion of being against America. And there's this huge reaction against labor unions, progressives in general, and conservatism becomes the order of the day. In 1920, Republicans are elected overwhelmingly to majorities in the Senate, House, and, of course, also to the presidency. And so Republicans dominate the country's national politics throughout the 1920s. It's a very conservative time politically. And again, good for big business. Massive deregulation movement, rolling back progressive reforms that restricted big businesses, and the economy booms in the 1920s. Period. This is called the Roaring 20s by some because of its amazing economic growth and also social change. One of the popular music styles of the day becomes jazz. It emphasizes the fast movement of the period, technological advancement, cultural change. Even though there's prohibition, people are drinking alcohol in speakeasies, on the side, kind of these illegal underground taverns of the 1920s. And in this age, because they're underground and illegal, they can't be regulated, which means that well-to-do women and men can sneak in together into these speakeasies and listen to the newest musical craze, jazz, which was developed in the 1860s by African Americans and now had, for many white Americans as well, embodied the spirit of this new time. Women finally had the vote and were exercising all sorts of new social activities. In fact, the new woman of the day was called the flapper. She would wear loose-fitting clothes that were comfortable, not because she thought men would like to see her dressed in that, but because she would like to do that. She would like to wear this kind of way. She would go and dance wildly to new kind of dances that were to jazz music, and also drink alcohol, and maybe do all sorts of things that traditional women weren't supposed to do. In this time period, you have the growth of birth control and advocates for even abortion, such as Margaret Sanger, who was rather unpopular in the 1920s, but began a national conversation on should we make birth control more accessible? Should we talk about abortion? And she becomes the mastermind behind the group that founds Planned Parenthood. Right, so Margaret Sanger, the mother of Planned Parenthood, gains her rise to national stardom, maybe infamy, in the 1920s. We also have the growth of automobiles because, again, the economy is booming. Henry Ford is the maker of the Ford Motor Company, now just Ford. And he finds out a way to use mechanized assembly lines, repeated tasks, interchangeable parts to make automobiles faster, cheaper than ever before. So that in the 1920s, there's an unprecedented access to automobiles, which again spurs this sexual revolution as people can drive wherever they want. Also, more and more people are entering college because there's more prosperity. People can afford to go to college and send their kids to college in the 1920s. And so there's this growth of youth culture. Sex appeal is being used more in advertisements. There's more stories of sex becoming increasingly widespread among young people at this time period. It's a very wild time. And you also have the growth of new technologies, not only in terms of automobiles becoming more accessible, more roads, but also motion pictures. In 1915, the most famous motion picture of that decade was Birth of a Nation, which celebrated the Ku Klux Klan of the post-Civil War period. At that time, the Ku Klux Klan in the 60s was mostly dedicated to white supremacy, to putting African Americans back in their place, and overturning these reforms of Reconstruction that had given more rights to black Americans. So the Ku Klux Klan we look at today rightly as a racist, bad organization, but in 1915, most white Americans saw the Klan as this glamorized, wonderful organization that saved whites from black rule in the South. And it so excited a lot of white Americans, North, South, and West, that a lot of folks wanted to form a new Klan, and they did. In the 19-teens and 1920s, it reaches its height in 1925, where there are millions of white Americans who join the Ku Klux Klan. The largest chapters are in places like Indiana and Texas. Again, North and South. It's not just a Southern thing anymore. And now the Klan is not so much merely opposed to equal rights for black Americans, although that is true, but the new Klan in 19-teens and 20s, the second Klan, no relation to the first Klan, totally new organization, spurred on by the movie glorifying the old Klan. This second Klan is not just against African Americans, it's also against recent immigrants from Europe, ethnic minorities, Jews, these sorts of groups. And so the Klan only declines in the mid-1920s because, number one, there's a lot of internal scandals in the Klan, financial scandals, sexual scandals, but also there is a new law in 1924 that restricts immigration, that embodies a lot of these nativist, anti-recent immigrant attitudes of many Americans. And so the Klan doesn't have as much of a reason to exist anymore. It's one of its main objectives, opposing more Jews, more recent immigrants from Europe coming into the U.S., has been accomplished. And this quota system, set up by our 1924 Act, sets up the basis for the quota system we have today. It was greatly modified in the 1960s, but more or less this idea of national quotas for immigrants was a thing that started a century ago in the 1920s. Now, in addition to The Birth of a Nation, this film that spurred on the Second Klan, you also have films like the first talkie, the first film with audio, talking and music in a movie, which was cutting-edge technologies. In 1927, this first talkie was called The Jazz Singer. Again, using this new jazz musical style, playing jazz music in the movie. And the fundamental struggle of the film is a Jewish family. And the father's more traditionalist. He's a cantor. He's a religious singer. And he's ashamed of his son, who has become a jazz singer, who has become worldly. And this is a great tension of the 1920s as well. With new technologies, with the automobile, with more sexual license, people pushing against a lot of traditional boundaries, more people in college thinking new thoughts. You also have a controversy between theological conservatives and theological liberals. And this is called the fundamentalist modernist controversy. Fundamentalists on one side are seeking to preserve the fundamentals of the faith, the inerrancy of Scripture as God's Word, miracles in the Bible, the virgin birth, Jesus being divine and raised from the dead, really truly, as basic fundamentals of the Christian faith. On the other hand, you have modernists who are saying, well, this is a new age. We have radio being used on a grand scale, this new technology to instantaneously communicate across vast distances. Of course, railroads and automobiles are ubiquitous. They're everywhere at this time period. And again, there's changing social norms. A lot of people aren't believing, these fundamentals of the faith anymore, so maybe we should adapt the churches. Maybe we should question these so-called fundamentals. And so fundamentalists and modernists are battling it out in churches, particularly in the North. There's not many modernists in the South at this time period. But in northern denominations, they're fighting it out, and more or less, modernists tend to win. At least they win the ability to be tolerated. And once modernists are tolerated, their numbers grow in northern denominations. So fundamentalists lose the battle for the soul of the northern Baptist and Presbyterian denominations. But many of them become separatists. They leave those churches and form their own churches, found their own schools, seminaries, radio programs, and institutional networks as a kind of underground resistance to the modernist mainstream in the culture. But of course, a lot of people in those mainline churches are themselves fundamentalists. They just don't want to kick out the modernists necessarily. You also have fundamentalists and modernists clashing at the so-called trial of the century, the monkey trial, the Scopes trial in 1925. Basically, it's a test case about evolution. Should the teaching of evolution be banned? And the court eventually finds that no, they uphold a state law that says, yes, evolution is a banned thing, it shouldn't be taught. But there continues to be this controversy. Should we teach evolution? And fundamentalists are not only reacting against people questioning the inerrancy of the Bible, but they're also, generally speaking, against people that are promoting evolution. In part because evolution was connected to this idea of social Darwinism. That is, that, if people are going to die, they better do it and reduce the surplus population. And this idea that it's survival of the fittest, not only in nature, but also in humanity. That humans are all about survival of the fittest, and if you're poor and if you can't take care of yourself, you don't matter. And so that's why a lot of fundamentalists were concerned about evolution, not simply because they thought it contradicted Genesis 1 and 2, but also they were afraid of the social consequences. If we teach our kids that they're nothing but animals, what does that do to morality? That was a legitimate concern of the time. You also have not only women that are engaged in more suspicious activities from a traditional point of view, but you also had women who are becoming ministers. So Amy Semple McPherson is the first woman in American history to be a mega church pastor in the 1920s. She founds her Angelus Temple in Los Angeles in the 1920s, and it has a crowd of thousands of people every Sunday. She's near Hollywood. She gets Hollywood people in to have productions on her stage, to have plays and musicals celebrating basic conservative fundamentalist teachings about the Bible. But nevertheless, she's a woman preacher. And she has a big sex scandal in 1927. Some people think that she had an affair. There's no proof. She weathers the storm, continues in her ministry, but shows the ability of women to really succeed in the 1920s to challenge traditional gender roles. And it helps that she is a Pentecostal. Right? She's charismatic. And so saying, well, if the Holy Spirit's gifted me, who's to say I can't do this? So it shows that Pentecostals, charismatics, as we would say today, are pushing the boundaries of what's acceptable in churches and even giving women opportunities for leadership in the church. You also have black nationalists who are reacting against the growth of organizations like the Ku Klux Klan and saying, this is terrible for situation for African Americans. We're being socially segregated by law, Jim Crow laws. We're having our political rights stripped away by law. And there's a sense in which we'll never be able to get ahead. We're going to be perpetually inferior as long as we stay in this country. So Marcus Garvey is a Jamaican-born man, and he organizes this international coalition all over the Americans. So not only from the United States, but up into Canada, in the Caribbean, in South America, uniting people of African ancestry in this pan-Africanist black nationalist movement, a separatist movement saying, we need to be separated from whites. We need to up and remove ourselves from this country and move back to Africa, because that's the only chance that African Americans have to have a fair shake. He says the odds of an African American man, a black man, becoming a governor of a state or president of the United States is about the same odds as Satan taking up residence in heaven. That's how bad it was for African Americans. He could not imagine the possibility of a black man becoming a mayor of a major city, a governor or president. Of course, and now we have African Americans who are mayors of major cities, governors of large states, and even we've had a black president recently. So again, Marcus Garvey tells us more about how millions of African Americans who had joined his organization, his black nationalist organization, he tells us a lot about how many African Americans were fed up with their treatment as racial inferiors of whites in the 1920s. Now, let's talk about Prohibition. So we know the economy is booming. There's a lot of social change, social disruption. People are saying that, oh, the country's falling apart into decadence. There's social decline because of all this jazz music and people drinking alcohol and all of this hullabaloo, and women doing new things. But you also have other reasons for other movements, including Prohibition, which is seen today as a conservative backlash, but is in fact a profoundly progressive movement. And here's why it's progressive. Prohibition was pushed in the 19-teens and before, and the idea behind Prohibition was not merely to stop people drinking. It was to end the power of the alcohol industry, which was, again, a particularly notorious, corrupt industry that was willing to do anything, say anything, buy anyone out to get its agenda advanced. And it was truly a horrible organization. You also have the rationale against alcohol for legal prohibition of alcohol, because a lot of people have their lives destroyed by alcohol. You have the medical reasons, cirrhosis of the liver. It kills people early. You also have the effects on their families and friends. Men going out to drink in the saloon, getting drunk, coming back home, beating their wives, raping their wives, beating their children, spending all the money that should be spent on clothes and rent on alcohol, ruining families. Okay? And this is happening to hundreds of thousands of families around the country over decades, in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. So there's the moral reason. And so ministers of the gospel, women, are taking the lead role in opposing alcohol and saying we need legal prohibition. And you have ministers organizing the Anti-Saloon League, the first modern single-issue lobbying organization. So whenever you think of lobbyists, think of the Anti-Saloon League, who perfected lobbying and were able to, through ruthless tactics, push through the 18th Amendment to the Constitution, national prohibition. You also have women taking the forefront. Even before the Anti-Saloon League was founded in the 1890s, decades earlier, you had women leading the charge for alcohol prohibition in the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the WCTU, which was the largest women's organization in the country, one of the largest in the world, and the largest women's organization in the United States until the 1930s. A huge, huge women's organization. And these people who were prohibitionists were generally called dries. They were against alcohol. They tended to be middle class, tended to be white, again, and lined up with the progressive agenda. Alcohol prohibition is also progressive because how do you enforce it? The federal government. They're using the government as a way to progress society, to fight against an evil, corrupt interest, a trust, if you will, right? A monopoly, the evil alcohol industry. So again, it's a profoundly progressive reform. Dries are the prohibitionists. Wets are those who oppose prohibition. And wets tend to be racial and ethnic minorities, working class people, or very, very wealthy people. Wealthy people also loved alcohol, right? So working class and very rich, they loved alcohol. Middle class tended to be prohibitionist. And again, recent immigrants, folks from Europe. And also, speaking in terms of churches, they tend to be traditionalist churches. Catholics, Lutherans, Episcopalians. Those who clung tightly to the traditions from Europe, such as the tradition of drinking alcohol in communion. Communion wine. So if we're drinking wine in communion, why shouldn't we also drink wine outside of communion? And it seems to me that the Bible doesn't say anything about drinking as sin as such. Only drunkenness. Drunkenness is sin. Yes, yes, yes. But drinking in moderation, that's okay. That's the thinking of the wets. But dries were looking at it from a very scientific perspective. Again, very progressive. Because science tells us, then as now, it's true, alcohol is a poison. Sorry, it is. It is a poison. And so people said, one drop of poison is bad, so why should you have any poison? Let's ban it. It's always bad. So wets tended to be those who were from more traditionalist churches, recent immigrants, working class folks, who were suspicious of this white middle class reform effort that was also taking away alcohol. And along with the scientific approach of dries, you also have a further layer for being dry, technology. Grape juice is now available. It won't ferment into wine. We've technologically found a way to have grape juice that doesn't taste terrible, that's non-fermented. It's a miracle. And so a lot of these Protestant churches, Methodists, Baptists, Presbyterians, Congregationalists, most of these middle-class Protestant groups tend to embrace communion wine that is not wine, grape juice for communion, whereas the more traditional churches held to wine in communion, and therefore were less likely to embrace prohibition. Now, prohibition is progressive because it expands the power of the federal government to intervene into people's lives. You need a massive regime to shut down something as widespread as alcohol use in the United States. And so it's, again, a very progressive reform. This promotes government surveillance of suspected bootleggers and gangsters who are peddling alcohol, and even promotes the growth of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI. Grows because they need to enforce prohibition. Initially, prohibition is relatively successful, especially in rural areas that were already dry on the books. But by 1925, it's starting to fail. And it's particularly failing in urban centers like Chicago, Detroit, New York City, because these centers had never voted for prohibition before national prohibition. So there's a lot of people who resist it. And some of those resistors form more organized crime networks, not only to deal with alcohol, but other illicit trades as well. Prostitution, gambling, other drugs that are being peddled by organized crime, but chiefly alcohol as a front for their other endeavors as well. Al Capone in Chicago is a particularly notorious gangster. He's particularly violent. He goes to prison for tax evasion of all things, and then ends up being gunned down by one of his own lieutenants. So again, lives by the sword, dies by the sword. But organized crime is an increasing fear of this period, hence the growth of government surveillance, wiretapping, and the FBI at this time period. So you have a lot of authors that are reflecting on this period. They're reflecting on World War I and how destructive it is. A lot of anti-war literature by folks like Hemingway. And then, of course, F. Scott Fitzgerald, The Great Gatsby, Fitzgerald and others talking about this lifestyle of rich people having alcohol, living it up, trying to live the American dream in the 1920s and not always realizing it. So again, this time period is full of events that really influence the literature, African-American literature, the Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s. A lot of American authors like Fitzgerald and Hemingway go to Paris so they can drink in peace and also get outside of America and just schmooze with other European artists. So Prohibition helps drive Americans into more of a European fold, so they can drink alcohol and also sort through their thoughts. The 20s come crashing down in 1929 with the great stock market crash and other economic problems in 1929. This starts the Great Depression, and that's when Prohibition is overturned in 1933, a few years later, because it's seen as an opportunity to raise more taxes and make more jobs if we roll away Prohibition. We can tax that revenue of alcohol and spur the economy on. So again, 1920s is a roaring, exciting time. World War I, a time of great changes, but we've got to understand it in terms of progressive changes in the 19 nils and 19-teens, World War I, conservative backlash, 1920s, but society continues to change despite conservative politics of the Republican Party governing in that time period. On that note, I hope you've enjoyed this mini lecture and you have a productive rest of your week and have learned something new about the 1920s. Thanks for listening.